Recording in progress. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our spring event, Labor Relations in Time of Social Change, Negotiating Police Reforms. My name is Janine Braxton, and I am the Secretary of the Northern California chapter for the National Labor and Employment Relations Association. NorCal LERA has existed as a chapter of National LERA since 1977. The Sacramento chapter recently merged with the San Francisco and Bay Area chapters, and we are looking to recruit new members and board members as well. So if any of you are interested, please feel free to reach out to myself or any other member of our board, and we would be happy to provide additional information. I'm sure most of you on the call are familiar with our organization and what we do, but for those of you who are less familiar with LERA, the mission of NorCal LERA is to foster better relationships and understanding among professionals working in labor and employment relations, to provide a forum for discussion on emerging trends and legal developments like we're doing today, and to encourage beneficial and enjoyable interactions among representatives of labor, management, government, academia, and neutrals. We are very excited about today's program and have a spectacular panel lined up for you, including arbitrator and mediator, past president of the National Academy of Arbitrators and lecturer at Berkeley Law, Barry WINOGRAD. Also on our panel, we have partner at Raines, Lucia, Stern, St. Phalle, and Silver, A.LUCIA. And unfortunately, Carol ISEN could not join us today, but instead we are fortunate to have San Francisco's Employee Relations Director, Artis Graham, joining our panel today. We will have a question and answer session later in the program, so feel free to drop questions in the chat. We will also have an opportunity for networking at 1 p.m. for anyone who's interested, so feel free to hang around and you can have an opportunity to network with others who are joining the call today or the webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to our board member. I think I was going to hand it over to Rudy, but I don't know that he's hopped on yet. So with that, I will turn it over to Renee just to give us a little bit of a small introduction for the topic, and then we can get to our speakers.
All right, thank you. Let me just start by saying again, I want to thank the panel members for being here. This issue is one that has not only caught the attention throughout the United States, but frankly throughout the world. And so the creativity that I saw, I will just say that when I read the article about the work that Barry WINOGRAD and the 5 others had done, and I contacted our president, June Paeo, to say, this would be a great topic for one of our events, because it's evolving as we are watching the issue of police reform is evolving, but it's also evolving internally within police organizations. I've seen it firsthand. I mentioned before that I've recently done some work with the city and county of Spokane, and had worked with both their sheriff's department and their police department. And I was very impressed with the amount of work that they have done as police officers to be responsive to what their constituents are asking for. And so they said it's a culture shift within their organization, and they are treating mental health issues as a mental health problem, as opposed to necessarily a law enforcement issue. And so with that, I would just say again, thank you, Rocky, Barry, Artis, for being here. It really makes a difference for the people who are here who have an interest or work in labor and employee relations, to hear from you as experts. And I thank you.
And with that, we will turn the floor over to Barry WINOGRAD as our first speaker this afternoon.
Well, I pretty much offered what I had to say about what our group has done. Let me back up and add one other point that I think I overlooked. When we first met, and there was outrage all over the United States, right, after George Floyd was killed in such a terrible way. We said, well, what do we do? Who are we? And we said, well, we're looking at ourselves. Well, looking around, there's various proposals. There was the so-called defund movement. There's the people wanted to ban chokeholds. People wanted to do one thing or another that had to do with techniques and operations. So we said, what do we know anything about? And we figured what we know about is labor law and employee relations. So that was our chosen area of focus. We said, what could we do or say about that? So that's what led to the law review article. That's what led to the webinar. That's what eventually led to the proposals that we had. And we weren't looking to cause revolution or overthrow police departments, but we were looking to create avenues or opportunities for improvement, call it reform, and incremental changes in a sense. But we thought that we had that kind of role to play. So that's kind of what I should have said earlier, but I'm saying it now so that everybody sees where we were coming from. But we opted not to pursue changes through direct negotiations and collective bargaining in particular cities or municipalities or districts. We said, let's just, ultimately we went for the legislative approach. I don't know how many police departments there are in the state of California. I mean, I know what are there, about 1,500 school districts. So you got to imagine there are a similar number of police departments. And then, and the Bill of Rights applies to all kinds of law enforcement officers, not just in police departments. Rocky probably has a better idea of, some of the sort of the ins and outs of that. Anyway, that's what I would have to say in terms of what we did, the work we did, and how it unfolded and where we are now.
Thank you. And I heard you before we officially started, you were talking about Senate Bill 1088. For anyone who's just joining, can you just provide a little bit more information, just kind of about exactly what that does? I mean, how that impacts police reform, kind of what your thoughts are and how you see that moving forward.
1088, if adopted, would create a new subsection in the Bill of Rights Act that governs law enforcement in the state of California. And that's a set of procedural rights and requirements in terms of investigating disciplinary matters or in operations. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, frequently, labor agreements in the law enforcement area, and this is something that I don't think Rocky and I would have any disagreement of. Labor agreements commonly include either an incorporation of the police officer Bill of Rights, or they even attach it. I've seen some where they're kind of attached as an appendix, and incorporate that into the agreement so they can become part of an arbitration process, or maybe there's a civil service review process that's approved in the labor agreement. Those kinds of reviews of disciplinary actions can vary from one department to another. So sometimes those, I've had it in my career as an arbitrator, maybe other arbitrators on this call have had a similar experience, where the union advocate understandably says, hey, there were these violations, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, and therefore the discipline is imperfect because the procedural requirements of the act have been not followed. I personally have always adhered to a general harmless error standard in my arbitration career over several decades, but not all arbitrators do. And I know, again, from personal experience, that there are some arbitrators that say, you know what, if it's in the contract, that's what I have to follow. There's no exception. So we've thought, as one of our many proposals, that it would be good to put into the statute this standard, which many arbitrators follow. It's a generally used standard in both criminal and civil law. I think this group includes a number of lawyers. It's not the first time you've ever heard the expression harmless error. but essentially it means if there is a procedural error, it really shouldn't matter unless it prejudices someone's in terms of having an impact on the merits, an adjudication of the merits of the case. You know, was there a failure to explore evidence that was offered by a suspect or an officer who's being interrogated? Was there some violation of a bedrock constitutional right? You know, if somebody's denied a pre-disciplinary hearing or a Skelly type hearing, you know, what do you do about that? Well, there are remedies for that. You don't necessarily throw out the entire discipline. Maybe there's a front pay requirement. Anyway, it's an area of the law that's been widely used, but in the Bill of Rights Act, there's only one provision, 3309.5, which deals with enforcement. And it broadly permits injunctive relief and other appropriate remedies, but it really doesn't, it does not include a harmless error test. And it kind of leaves it open on a blank slate. And, you know, so we've seen cases where Bill of Rights claims get raised. Now, very early, back in 1988, I think it was, the California Supreme Court ruled in a case called Williams v. City of Los Angeles that a prejudice test would apply to the allegation in that case, which had to do with a failure to give an officer what's called a Liebarger warning about should he answer questions, his answers won't be used in court. He's got a type of use immunity from court. And that if he refuses to talk, he can then be subject to insubordination. But it's a statutory right as well. But in that particular case, the officer voluntarily spoke. The warning had not been given. The advice had not been given. He voluntarily spoke. And the Supreme Court said, you know what? He was going to speak. This is a statutory right. And you know, it's not prejudicial. He admitted to what happened. So, you know, you could argue, I suppose, that the Williams case is the law of the act, but it didn't say that, number one, and it hasn't really been applied in that fashion. Arguments still get made. Just this week, the Court of Appeal in Los Angeles published a decision involving an officer or two officers who, instead of coming to the aid, responding to a robbery in progress, they ignored the dispatch call, took their vehicle into an alley, and played Pokemon on their phone. Rocky, did you see this case?
Didn't read it, Barry.
Oh boy, your
sounds
blood,
like a good read though.
Your blood
Pokemon,
will boil.
yeah.
Your blood will boil because I mean, these cops, they were bad. They put other officers in danger and then lied about it. And there was a Bill of Rights Act case issue in the case, one of several. But you know, they said they weren't advised of their right to union representation in the first instance when their sergeant basically said, "Where were you guys? What were you doing?" So that's the kind of run-of-the-mill shop floor conversation that's permitted under the Bill of Rights Act. That does not give rise to a right to representation. They never asked for representation anyway. And even later on, they kept lying. So, you know, their discharge was upheld internally through a border rights hearing in the chief of police, and then it was upheld in Superior Court. And then what a surprise, it was upheld in the Court of Appeal. And then I guess a request was made to publish the decision, which they did. I think, you know, there's a fundamental question. If SB 1088 was in place, at least that issue would never even have surfaced, I think. I mean, a union would just be able to say, you know, or somebody would say at the appellate level, this is a loser. We're not going to advance this issue. Other issues maybe, but not that one. So, you know, but that's that case. It's a sort of an example of, I'm not sure what it's an example of. Just anyway. So anyway, that's what I have to say, Janine.
Thank you. And I do have another quick question for you. So in terms of what we have been seeing, I know you outlined kind of how All of this, at least the meeting initially, and some of the impetus for this was the George Floyd murder. But I think what I've certainly seen over the last few years is that something like this happens. Like I think Daniel was saying at the beginning, there was a recent incident in Michigan, and so
Right.
what we see is we see all of this focus on it, and suddenly it's an issue, and we're all focused on it. I would say just like guns, everyone gets super hyper focused on it after there's a shooting. Do you see a sustained interest in bringing about change, or do you think this ebb and flow kind of makes that a little bit difficult in terms of the focus and the energy that people tend to put in to this topic?
Is that a leading question?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, I think the ebb and flow is there, and add to the ebb and flow politics. Last session in the California legislature, there were several bills that were advanced, and one of them, SB 2, also by Bradford and Atkins, which involved the officer decertification, that attracted a huge amount of push and shove. And I think ROCKNE may have been involved in some of that too. This term, I don't know, our bill might be the only thing that's up there. And okay, so you could say everybody's sort of, got it out of their system or something, but we also have elections coming up in November. And it may be the case that people say, you know what, I'm just not going to push that kind of issue right now, because number one, there are issues of crime in this society. You got to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to know it, right? We have issues. What are they related to? What are the causes? Well, we'll argue about that, I suppose. But there are issues. That's a fact. And it is a fact that there are many police departments, and again, ROCKNE can speak more to this, and artists probably too, given San Francisco. There are many police departments that are understaffed. And we have retention and recruitment problems, or recruitment and retention, I should reverse the order there. So these are big issues. And, I think those influence the nature and pace of change that can be achieved as part of the ebb and flow, Janine, that you were talking about. So it's multiple factors.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, especially like you mentioned with elections coming up. With that, we will turn to our next speaker, San Francisco Employee Relations Director, Artis Graham. If you can provide just some general thoughts about the topic as well.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I was kind of thrust into this assignment this morning, so I'm a little ill-prepared. I'll just say that just to start. And we are also in the process of negotiating, trying to settle 33 different unions this week. So just by way of background. But all that being said, we're certainly I'm certainly glad to be here. We've had an opportunity, as Barry said, to really sort of address a number of significant issues that we have, namely recruitment and retention as an issue, and work with the POA to do so, and work with some of our other unions to do so. We've even tried to tackle that a little bit in bargaining this round. So one of the things we're looking at doing, for example, just on that topic, and then I'll go back to sort of the larger issue, is try to reach out to our parking control officers, so our meter maids, right? And we have these people called transit fare inspectors who go on the buses and write tickets, and so a variety of crafts that we have in San Francisco, because San Francisco is a place with unique working conditions, particularly as police officers or as people who are enforcement officers of different types. And so these individuals are already experienced. I mean, you all encountered the toughness that parking control officers in San Francisco have, I'm sure, at some point in your life. Parking in this town, it's not easy. And so the other cool thing about these other positions is that they have a lot more women of color. So by using these positions as a possible opportunity really to promote from within and encourage people to move into law enforcement. We're really hoping to not only provide opportunities for our existing workforce into a great career, which is law enforcement, but also we look to help to continue to have a very diverse police force, a very diverse sheriff's deputy, because San Francisco, remember, is both a city and a county. So we have police, we have sheriffs, we have district attorneys, investigators, we have probation officers. So we have quite a few law enforcement groups within our city. And so we're really, there's lots of avenues for people to go into and still engage in law enforcement. So that's one of the areas that we're trying to address the issue of recruitment and retention. And really also at the same time, really turn San Francisco into a place where people want to work because they really see that there's a tremendous opportunity for career upside. So just kind of wanted to tackle that because that's very exciting to me personally. As to some of the issues about working with POA and addressing sort of the labor management, labor relations situation, sort of in light of a number of the changes and the great deal of pressure that's on law enforcement. So I'm spoiled. I get to work with Rocky. He represents SFPOA, and so we work together a lot. And I think we really, Rocky and his board, are focused on public safety in San Francisco, and they really understand the issues of public safety in San Francisco and the unique environment that we operate in. And at the same time, still represent the interests of their members because they see those two things as very closely linked. It's not these two things are opposed to each other sort of relationship that I've seen in the last few months that we've been working together and meeting and conferring on a variety of topics. Now we go into bargaining next year. They're on a different cycle from the rest of our unions, but we go into bargaining the next year. We've also seen a similar situation with our sheriff's deputies. So there we have our sheriff's deputies in San Francisco, unlike in a lot of other counties, don't really have a patrol function. That's handled by the police department. However, they're still, law enforcement, and we still work with them, and we still operate under the same constraints as we would for police officers in many respects. So, and obviously there's still a lot of concern in terms of how sheriff's deputies interact with our inmate population, right? Those people who have been arrested or are pending trial or have been arrested and have been convicted and are serving their sentences in the county jail. But we really are sort of working with them to make sure that we're addressing issues and meeting confer with them. Our big issue there, frankly, is just having enough people to do the work. We have we've had a very hard time retaining our sheriff's deputies for a variety of reasons, mostly retirement, frankly. But and COVID prevented all of us from really running police academies and doing these types of things to allow us to recruit additional people. So, but we have an excellent relationship with Mustagny as their lawyers as well. Not as good as Rocky, because it's Rocky, let's just be honest. But,
Thank you. I'll take it.
We
Stop
are
laughing, Rudy.
Mustagny we've worked with them on a variety of topics to representing their members, representing the safety of our people, as well as citizens of the city who were trusted to their care, frankly. And so, because we have a lot of people who are in our jails who have mental health problems, et cetera, right? So it really is entrusted to the care of our sheriff's deputies and our management sheriff's association. So as I say, I really, in my experience over the last year, what we've been able to do with our law enforcement unions and bargaining units is really be focused on how do we protect our folks, recruit and attract and retain additional people who work in these conditions, and protect them as well, right? So we've had conversations around all of those things. And so that's the most I have to offer right now without a direct specific question off the top of my head, since I wasn't entirely prepared to come this morning.
No worries, that is great. I do have a question for you. So I heard you mention that part of one of the strategies is to try and recruit more people of color in the law enforcement. what are some mechanisms that you guys are using to do that? What are ideas to do that essentially?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the biggest ideas are really to look. So it's not so much that we are, directly looking to recruit people of color per se into law enforcement. Although I certainly know that to be of interest to our chief, and our sheriff. It's more an effort of, we know we have this pool of people who also are people of color, who also are women, who also have already demonstrated that they have the mental toughness and fortitude to stand toe to toe with our population in San Francisco, which is unique, and enforce the law, frankly, in the case of parking control officers and transit fare inspectors. I mean, they write these tickets. It's not the same, obviously, as being a police officer. And there's a number of other additional steps we will have them go through. The academy, background checks, all of these other things that go along with becoming a police officer. But they're showing that they have those kind of hard to identify skills. One of the problems that we've had with new police officers in San Francisco is just driving, right? A lot of young people who come from other places to be police, because San Francisco is an attractive place to be a police officer. They don't know the city well, right? And they also are intimidated with driving here. Like, if you've ever driven here, if you're, I'm not beating up on Concord. It just happens to be where Rocky's from. So I could, poke him a little bit with this. If you're from Concord, driving there is very different from driving in San Francisco. It just is, right? And so our PCOs, they know how to do that, right? Like, they drive around San Francisco all the time. And so, so they possess these soft skills that we need. And as I say, they also, it's a large population of African-American women, Latino women, Asian women who do this work. So, me personally, I'm excited about that opportunity for folks to be able to move into law enforcement and, automatically get them up in pay just by becoming an entry-level police officer at the ranks. And then, of course, there's a tremendous upside. And I will just say, as another aside, San Francisco has a great history, frankly, of being a place where, for people who wish to promote from within, really have a space to do that. And that could be because we're such a diverse public employer. With being a city and a county, we have a lot of functions that other places may not have. But, and so this is a way for someone who got to benefit from that system to also put in place mechanisms for other people so that they can also benefit from the variety of options that the city has to afford them.
Got it. Yeah, no, very interesting that you mentioned the driving. I know I have to mentally prepare myself when I have to go to San Francisco for work, and making sure that my maps are on and so on and so forth. Because the last thing I want to be is on a one-way street going the wrong way. That would just kill me, literally. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Now we will hand it over to our next speaker, A.LUCIA.
So thanks very much, Janine. And I want to just thank everyone at LERA for inviting me to participate. Rudy reached out to me, and I have a great relationship with Rudy. Many of other people that are on the call I've worked with, Barry Artis, Renee Main, Yuval Miller. I'm seeing some familiar names. So, in advance of the presentation, we were given some questions about police reform, and there was just a lot of stuff in there. And I mean, a lot of material. And I just want to just make some opening remarks about it generally to play off of some of the issues that Barry and Artis have raised. But I think it's really important, and I'll be quick. People need to know who I am and the perspective that I bring to this panel and to my profession and to my relationship with my clients. I've been a lawyer. I started as a law clerk when Jerry Brown was governor for the first time in Sacramento, working for an organization called PORAC. And throughout my career, I've had the fortune of working for a lot of law enforcement agencies. And for the most part, what I have focused on over the last 10 to 15 years is representing my clients in labor relations. It's a very broad topic, as all of you know. And that includes all sorts of things: litigation, meet and confer, unfair practice charges, what have you. But I just want to say that over the last couple of years, the profession has changed dramatically. We've talked about the death of George Floyd. We've talked about statutory proposals. We've talked about recruitment and retention. But I, over my career, have never seen the change in law enforcement and the profession as I have in the last 2 to 3 years. So there has been a radical change in the way police unions have to react to all of that. And so this is a very serious subject for me, police reform, because when you talk about police reform, and Barry speaks to it in terms of legislative proposals, all the legislation that was passed, for the most part, ends up at my doorstep. And I have to deal with artists, folks over at the police department. And I, by the way, I do represent more than San Francisco POA. Our law firm represents about 415 law enforcement associations throughout the state of California. And I've had the pleasure of working for many associations. I call it south of the Tehachapis. But the ones that are probably of most interest to all of you, I represent San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, Richmond, represented Vallejo POA for a while, and a lot of other smaller associations, and yes, artists, even the Concord POA. So, and for Rudy, and he knows this, Daly City POA. So his old stomping grounds. So I have the perspective of representing large, small, medium-sized police unions. But over the last couple of years, most of my time and energy has been involved in the implementation of police reform. And that, you know, to some people means legislation. To some people, as artists said, it's a cultural change. Whatever you define it as, it ends up at the doorstep of me. When I say me, I mean us. I mean the folks that do the pick and shovel work of labor relations in the trenches. You can pass all the legislation you want, but if you're going to change a culture, it has to be brought about through a meaningful process where there's buy-in by both parties. And I will say, I'm being very general, you know, 60,000 feet, and I really welcome more specific questions. But over the last couple of years, I have seen an incredible attempt, not by all, but by a lot of folks, especially those in San Francisco, to create partnerships with the unions. I know that San Francisco has a rich tradition of great labor relations with their unions, but it's been very trying over the last couple of years since George Floyd was killed. It's been brought to the fore, and I'm very proud of the fact that if you Google my name or any one of the clients I represent for the last 2 or 3 years, you'll find very little acrimony, demonizing, hostility coming out of those POAs in particular. I'm very lucky to have leadership in San Francisco right now, in Oakland, in Richmond, in Berkeley. They're very, very attuned to the profession, to the community needs. Artist said this, he was dead right. We are now not just about labor, we're about enhancing the profession, we're about community relations and transparency. Now, I want to say that I couldn't say that 5 or 6 years ago. So the movement towards police reform has had incredible advantages. And as long as I can have people that I deal with, now, you know, I'm a big process guy, huge. To me, everything is about process. Some lawyers on the screen know due process. If you're not a lawyer, you have a general sense of due process. So for me, it's about process. And in the process, the foundation has to be respect. I have to have respect for the person across the table. I have to respect not only them, but their constituency, their interests, and the process by which we have to achieve our goal of reaching some accommodation on police reform. And again, we can define that any way we want. But in the end, if we have a respectful process, if we treat each other with respect, if we have open dialogue with people who really care to listen, we don't have a lot of the problems that you see across the country with police reform. We don't have it here. You can generalize about a profession. I'm proud to say I'm the son of a Teamster. I grew up in a Teamster union house. And you can say what you want about any profession, any trade, but you cannot generalize about police unions. You cannot generalize about police union lawyers. And so what happens is those of us on the screen who are still in the trenches having to do this work, we have to communicate with each other. MMB 3500 is to enhance communication, promote communication. What does that mean? It means we have civil discourse. And I'm sad when I have to say that we cannot, as a society, have civil discourse. That's been a problem that we have. But I'll tell you what, in my world, we have to have civil discourse. When I sit down with artists and deal with some very, very sticky, thorny, troubling issues, we have to be able to talk to each other. So I have stayed maybe 80,000 feet high, but I think this group, more than a lot of groups that I deal with, understand the vital importance of communication, active listening, and respect. Now, Janine, there's a lot of other things you wanted us to address that I haven't addressed much, but so I'm going to end there. I know it's 12:40. I think this program ends at 1 o'clock. So if you want me to hit any one of those other questions, I'd be more than happy to do it, or I'll defer to others.
No, that was fantastic. I've made some notes. You said that enhancing the profession, community relations, and transparency. Specifically on the issue of transparency, I feel like a lot of just what's been in the media, just the extent to which this, general population has honed in on this issue just of policing and police reform, and with all the social movements that we've seen over the last few years, I think, from a very lay perspective, as someone who's not a police officer or someone who just doesn't have the inside knowledge, transparency, I think, is what the people want.
Right.
What do you see in terms of transparency? What can be done? What would you say has been done in terms of just making the inner workings of what you do on a daily basis and the relationships and the dialogue that you're having transparent to people who, have their own opinions, but they're not informed, right? Because things aren't transparent. What have you seen move in that space?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, in my world, our firm represents law enforcement, firefighters, non-sworn folks. And so we have basically two groups, primary groups within the firm, those who do what I do, and then those who handle the individuals in their particular disciplinary action, internal affairs investigation, criminal cases. So when I talk about transparency, I'm going to limit it to the labor part, not to, it's like Barry's referencing the legislation that was passed and introduced by Senator Skinner. A lot of that had to do with personnel files. So an individual's police personnel files have now been made more transparent, if you will, on certain types of matters. So I'm gonna focus on the transparency element and how it affects my work. My work is no different than Rudy's work. My work is representing working people. And if my work means that I have to negotiate a contract or work through a grievance, I don't think the transparency rules should be any different for me than they are for Rudy, because ultimately we do a lot of work where, and he has members, I have clients, where if we negotiated in a fishbowl, for example, and there are places in this country where negotiations are supposed to be open and completely transparent. So Janine, I'm not sure if that's what you meant by transparency, but that's where I'm going with it. If you want me to come back and define it differently, I will. But the point is that when we talk about transparency in labor relations, first of all, remember, we're talking about human beings and their employment. And a lot of the issues that we deal with in labor should not be put on Facebook. They should not be put on live stream, videos. They should not be in social media. These are private matters. How much they make, that's not private, right? Whether they engage in criminal conduct, that's not private. But when I negotiate a contract, and there was a move in San Francisco not that long ago to make my negotiations and my negotiations only with the POA basically put in a fishbowl. And we all know, anybody on management and labor side on this screen knows that when you start doing that, you've really undercut, I think, the efficiency, the undergirdings of effective communication. And I think what you've done is you've done a disservice to the parties. Look, I don't care whether it's somebody trying to negotiate a peaceful settlement in Ukraine or trying to negotiate with a local labor union. We all know, everyone on this screen knows that when it gets right down to it, there has to be conversations between two people, maybe three, maybe four, in a setting where they can speak freely, and they speak freely to each other because they know there won't be any recrimination. There won't be any consequences for maybe using a term or a phrase in an inartful way, and we can get right down to it. So the transparency element in labor relations, I think, is where it needs to be right now. And I don't see any need for my clients to be subject to different rules in labor relations on transparency. I think when you refer to society and people generally, I think they're thinking like the police department, like what's going on in the police department. And then when we talk about discipline, there are statutes now where personnel files have been opened up. So hopefully I hit something there for you.
Yes, yeah, you did. I think we have another question from our board.
Okay.
I do have a question around the topic of negotiability. And so I don't want to identify any specific case, but it's not unusual for employers sometimes to argue that changes to police reform, because they involve transparency and accountability, are fundamental managerial decisions that are outside the scope of representation. And one of the arguments they have to make to get there is that that it's not amenable to bargaining. And so I'm curious, on a broader scope, and Barry and I know artists have dealt with this. Do you think that there can be progress made at the bargaining table over reforms without compromising? In other words, is it amenable to bargaining?
Over the last 2 years, I can tell you absolutely yes. It's been done. It's being done. And I'll speak for, again, those associations that I mentioned earlier. You haven't seen too much activity from us at PERB over disputes concerning what's bargainable and what's not. I mean, here's a basic fundamental rule that I've adhered to, and I'm not just going to say me, the people that I deal with in those cities. It's very simple. We as lawyers plant a flag. They'll tell me this is not subject to bargaining, and I'll say respectfully, I disagree. And then the retort always is, at least with me. I'm just gonna look, I'm not speaking for every lawyer. I'm not speaking for every lawyer in my firm, but for me, it's pretty simple. Let's not get hung up in process. Let's talk, let's stake our claim. Let's not waive our positions, but let's have a conversation about really the interests and where we need to go. And in 99% of the time, we get to where we need to be. And we haven't waived our right to do, they haven't waived theirs, I haven't waived mine, but we put aside the legal challenges. Barry refers to, harmless error, and I get it. That's in a different context, but in labor, that's litigation, if you will. But in labor, you're right. Those issues come up all the time. I've been really lucky because the people I deal with in these municipalities understand that if we get involved in a legal wrangling over what's bargainable and what's not, and my firm does this. I mean, you're aware we have the Sonoma County case on the ballot measure where we prevailed and we set aside part of a ballot measure that was passed up in Sonoma County about, you know, civilian oversight. But that was because, well, there are facts there I'll talk about later. But to answer your question, sum up, it doesn't matter to me. If it does sometimes, but if we really want to get to yes, you know, we all know what that means, then let's just talk. Let's reserve our positions and talk. I don't know if that's what you needed to hear from me, but that's really what is going on. I mean, you haven't seen one charge or one lawsuit from me in these cities. Now, there were some over the vaccination mandate. We had some issues there, in part because, especially in San Francisco, we had the struggle between a public health officer and the city and who had authority and blah, blah, blah. But in the end, you didn't see a lot of it. So, you know, police reform is in full force and effect. I've been in Oakland for 20 years on their voluntary consent decree, I'll call it. That union, and I've been there for 20 plus years, we did not file one grievance in 20 years. We're on the verge of getting out of there. The city is, and the union did not once do that. Through all the police reform in San Francisco, we did not do that. So there we go.
I don't know if we can volley that question to Barry. Did you have any thoughts on that? I don't know that I can summarize the question as great as Felix did. So,
Well, I wanted to ask Rocky a question, and I'll pick up on Oakland. I mean, we know from other conversations we've had that part of the issue here is, you know, what does reform mean? It's not just reform at the rank and file level, right?
Right.
It also means reform at the management level, and you know, we are blessed to have someone like Rocky who can talk, you know, to the other side of the table, and it becomes more of one table than two sides, if you follow what I'm saying. But take Oakland as an example. And earlier in the period of the, well, it wasn't a trusteeship, whatever it was called, the consent decree of the settlement, you know, process. The monitor, there were several reports, but there was one particular monitor report that analyzed, what was it, Rocky? 40 arbitration awards or something like that.
Yes.
And that report emphasized, well, yeah, there was misconduct. There were misconduct issues that went to arbitration, but the city lost many of those cases because of lack of preparation of the attorneys, because of management foul-ups in the handling of the investigation or the processing of the case. Has, you know, if there's going to be reform in departments, and if we're going to effectively get away from you know, ongoing adversarial combat, as Rocky just described, getting away from it, we have to, I think, and Rocky, correct me if I'm wrong, tell me, you know, what changed in Oakland so that those problems went away? You know, the problems on the management side, and I mean, you say you didn't have any grievances. That suggests to me that there's something good happening there. You know,
Yeah,
I mean, because you're not a lay down dead kind of union guy.
No,
you know, that's not you.
No, we're not doing that. No, we don't do that. I don't do that anywhere. But the reality is, you know, you raise an excellent point. It was one of the issues that I fleshed out when I got these questions, and that is, ultimately, it's accountability. Okay, people want to hold cops accountable, and I'm all for it. Look, they get paid a lot of money. They have great benefits. They have great pensions, and the community should expect that they conform to standards. And I'm all about holding people accountable. But what's really missing, and you've nailed it, what's really missing in a lot of these jurisdictions is the lack of accountability, starting with the supervisors, into the management ranks, into the chief sheriff ranks, into the city manager ranks, and into the electeds ranks. Nobody is held accountable for a culture, right? Now in Oakland, what happened was the culture changed. It took 20, well, I think it changed 10 years ago, but it's now 20 years in and the culture changed. And what happened there is that Judge Henderson and now Judge Orrick have really demanded accountability from the command staff, most of whom I know and have represented when they were, as my Irish president in Oakland says, when they were wee lads. Anyway, so the point is that I couldn't agree more. Look, I represent a lot of police managers. I know and have represented a lot of police chiefs. And you know what? They need to be held accountable too. They need to hold their own people accountable. If we had more of that, we'd have less of these. Look, the George Floyd case was tragic, but how did that case happen? What structure was in place that allowed that cop to do that?
Or lack of structure, maybe.
Right,
Yeah.
there wasn't much. Or the
Let me
culture.
let me ask you. Okay, so are you saying that we have to have like third-party intervention, a Judge Henderson, a Judge Orrick, their appointed managers, appointed monitors? I mean, do you really need that? And I guess maybe just for the worst case situations, hopefully, but not every day.
No, you don't need that. We have a place now. We have local, state, federal governments where elected officials should be doing their job, not just, politicizing issues, but helping govern. I don't mind ideologues and ideology. It's great. We need that for a robust society and government. We need conflicting opinions. We need advocates, but we need people who are governed, not just sit in a chair 3 hours a week, but to hold people accountable. They should be doing their due diligence. Like, what's happening in my police department in Concord, California? And the people who run the city, the electeds, they have the authority. That's the whole thing, Barry. A lot of the legislation you've referred to, I'm not opposed to that, a lot of it. But why does the state have to impose this? Why don't these local officials just take on the responsibility of doing the job they were elected to do? So do we need consent decrees everywhere? No. Are they warranted in some places? Unfortunately, yes. But if people did their jobs, and I'm talking about the unions as well, we wouldn't have a lot of these problems.
Well, let me ask you kind of a related question. In San Francisco, and you and Artis can speak to this, you have a slightly different disciplinary framework in terms of accountability, because you've got the Department of Police Accountability, whatever, with Paul Henderson, that department, whatever its title is.
DPA.
DPA. So is that an effective tool for accomplishing the objectives you're talking about?
Okay, I know we're running out of time, but that's another hot spot for me. So let me tell you what it is.
Okay, you got 4 minutes.
I'm okay with police oversight. I'm okay with civilian oversight, but I'm not okay with civilian oversight being populated by advocates. Advocates who have a political or social agenda, one, and two, they need to be arbiters, not advocates.
Right,
if they want to sit in the chair of a chief of police, let's not be an advocate. Let's try to put on the pretense of being neutral, because of a lot of these oversight bodies, they don't do that. The other thing, you talk about legislative attempts and formats and structures. You said, I think you mentioned earlier, you wanted to take the legislative approach as opposed to the bargaining approach on some of this. Well, there is no legislation that I'm aware of in the state of California that legislates the conduct, responsibilities, or accountability of civilian oversight. None. And what's mind-boggling to me is that I think the most important function a government serves is to protect its citizens, right? And law enforcement. And if we as a society delegate the management, oversight, and operation to a body that's not elected, not accountable, not trained, what have we done? I have proposed in multiple cities, in places I've mentioned, other places, when civilian oversight was introduced, through ballot measures where I met and conferred. I tried to get in those provisions specific language that said these people on these bodies will have to go through some type of training process to understand what it's like to work as a cop. Two, I've said, and I want the union to have at least an hour or two with these folks to talk to them. Guess what? In every instance, no, it would not. They didn't want to put it in the legislation, and they don't do it now. Some do, but there's a pushback when I try to bring my culture, my client's culture and experiences into those bodies. They rejected it. How many legislators, I mean, local elected officials do ride-alongs? How many police oversight folks do ride-alongs? Not many.
So
Artists,
well, let me ask Artist. Artist, are you there? Maybe we lost him. No,
Yeah,
there he is.
I hit the wrong button on my computer. Sorry.
It's okay. So what do you think is about DPA? Is it helping, hurting? What is it? Rocky is not the big fan.
Yeah, I mean, that's Rocky's job to not be a big fan, I guess. But I haven't had honestly, I just haven't had much interaction with them, frankly. So it hasn't really to my level of attention recently. But I'm sure when Rocky needs me to work on it, he'll let me know.
Well, Rocky, your idea for having a state law that governs oversight, you could do that. That would preempt local controls.
right?
And
Right.
kind of isn't that happening in the landlord area too? And
Right,
rent
it happens
control
everywhere. But Barry, I'm not opposed to civilian oversight. Let's make this clear. I am not opposed to it, but let's do it right. I mean, so a lot of places they do it right. I'm not indicting every
Okay.
city. I'm not, even the cities I'm mentioning. I'm just saying it's something that we need to talk about.
Right. Well, it just hit 1 o'clock, so Janine, I don't want to turn into a pumpkin.
Yeah, no, thank you. I did get one more question. I'll throw it in there since it's technically 1 o'clock. Do you think it's necessary to use the meet and confer process to accomplish these conversations and this dialogue?
Yes, I think we can always use the meet and confer process to have a dialogue. I think, you have to, it's not always going to be decision, meet and confer. Sometimes it's going to be impacts, meet and confer. Sometimes it's going to be meet and discussion, right? But I think, a framework around how you have these conversations and bringing labor and management together and having a record of the conversations, I think all of that is important and valuable.
Janine, I just have a question, and that is if any of the panelists are able to stay, if any of the other attendees have any questions that they'd like to ask them.
I can't stay. I have a meet and confer right now.
I can only stay for a little bit because I'm trying to get that DAIA contract settled for you, artists.
No, my understanding is it's all ready to rock and roll. We just need Rocky to sign it. And then
Right. Well, Rocky has to get into a meeting to sign it. So I'll stay for a few minutes, but I have to jump off and deal with that as well.
Thank you for having me, everyone. I really appreciated joining you. So it was a real honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Artist, before you go, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Everybody should give him a round of applause because he and others on the San Francisco team, and Rudy, you're still there too? Yeah,
Yep,
Rudy's
here.
Rudy, I mean, what was it, 35, 40 unions? I don't know. They somehow have pulled off the miracle of miracles, which is to negotiate. And there may be a few exceptions or a few issues that are hanging out there, here or there.
Just a few.
Well, hopefully just a few. But I'm advised that the miracle of miracles is that they have negotiated in a period of a few weeks the terms and conditions of employment, not just wages, benefits, and other compensation issues, but all terms and conditions of employment, special adjustments for particular contracts, and so on and so forth, for every union in San Francisco, with one or two exceptions that have contracts either not in play right now or later durations. So I mean, that's just, as someone who's been involved in San Francisco labor relations for a long time, I've never seen or heard of anything like this, and it'll go down in history as something that's a great benefit to the city and county and its citizens. So I tip my hat to you. If I was wearing a hat, I'd tip it.
Thank you very much.
You and Rudy and other
I
people.
mean,
It's
Rudy,
really astonishing.
I gotta be honest with you guys, it would not have been possible without Rudy's work and leadership. Carol Eisen, who's worked so hard, she made it sick, so
Right.
she's not here, but you know, and obviously, of course, the mayor's office. But you know, we're not quite done. We're very close to done.
Yeah.
But it's been great, and we appreciate the accolades certainly. But again, David Canham and Rudy Gonzalez and their leadership at the Public Employees Committee has been outstanding, and really helped to make this possible. So I really have to appreciate them and tip my hat to them.
Yeah,
Well,
just
I
want
would
to
say
say
that,
I'm
thank you,
Pacific.
Arbitrator Winograd, but Artis and his team, Carol Eisen, who was going to be the panelist, and it speaks to your abilities, Artis, that you could get thrust into this as she's come down with an illness, probably because of all these in-person meetings we've had. But the DHR team has set a model, I believe, for how to deal with labor at this scale, but also with so much integrity and shared interest that we're going to be paying a lot of cancellation fees, Arbitrator Winograd, but we'll be happy to do it.
You know,
Yeah, let me just weigh in on that. I'm precipient to this because I'm involved with one of these sessions, and there are people spending all day and into the night in San Francisco. And I also want to applaud Rudy because they've totally partnered with folks like Artis and Carol, and it's been amazing to watch. I've been involved just to the slight degree, but it's been amazing. And it talks about the partnership between management and labor. And we have two people on the screen right now who are the epitome of that. So my hat's off to you as well.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you,
Good
everyone.
work, everybody. Yeah.
Thanks for
Keep
having
it
me.
up. All right. Get some sleep.
Yeah, Rudy's been rubbing his eyes the entire time.
You know, Rudy sent me an email last. What time was that? I looked at an email. It was like 1:26 a.m. Rudy.
Yeah, we have 3 more tables to wind up. And really what's interesting about this conversation is we're doing this all in the backdrop that police and fire are next year,
Right.
right?
Right.
So we know, and we were all part of an overall budget construct if Carol were here, she would have told you at the height of people picketing homes of members of the Board of Supervisors, demanding complete abolishment of the police department. At the height of all that, there was a budget construct on at that point, $12.3 billion budget that was dependent on the deferral of wages of the police association, the firefighters, and safety management. And because of that, they led, frankly, we all got our raises and they postponed them for the sake of the city budget, but then added another year onto their contract. And in doing so, had to come before the Board of Supervisors, the Budget Committee. And so it was an opening for advocates and others to really stick them in the middle of this conversation at, you might argue as an advocate, the best possible time, or maybe as a participant, the worst possible time. But it really taught us a lot of hard lessons. And now we know that that's going to happen again. So we're going to find out early next year if Artis and others, and I don't know, are they going to talk to the police commissioners when they prepare their proposals? Are they going to talk to the various advocacy groups, the groups of lawyers who took us front row in the media in some of those conversations? We'll see. But I think that a lot of credit goes to the practitioners, and I hope that people can spread the good word about joining LERA, because we don't have the safety of this room often to have some of these conversations. And Rocky and Carol and others, and to a certain extent, some of the neutrals lived it in San Francisco, and you're going to live it again here in a short 6 months, I think. So it'd be interesting to check in with you again later.
Great. Okay. Well, I suppose other people have questions that Rocky and I are still here. Rocky said he'd hang out for a few minutes. Yeah. It's too early to start drinking, I think so.
Speak for yourself, Barry.
I am speaking for myself. I wouldn't speak for you.
Really?
It's happy hour somewhere in the world.
I know, someplace.
Yeah, there you
Yeah.
go.
So, well, okay. I thank you. I thank you on behalf of the Law Enforcement Reform Study Group. That's a little group that gave ourselves a name. So, all right, we'll see what happens. Okay. All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you.
Can we all say thanks to our
Yes.
host, Janine Braxton?
Yeah,
Yes,
Janine,
thank
great.
you, Janine.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice job.
You know, Janine, you sent us like a 2-page set of questions and topics, and did we get through even like a third of them?
You did. I think I wanted to touch on it generally, and then just go wherever the conversation took us organically. And I think both of you guys did a fantastic job, and artists
right.
for jumping in at the last minute. No, very, very enlightening. I didn't share this at the beginning, but so I do employment defense, wage and hour class actions. And so this is not what I do on a daily basis, but obviously, like, I think much like the general population, just the idea of police reform and all of that, like that's the exposure that I've had. And so it's very, very nice to have this insight and get the, perspectives that all three of you have brought to the table today. So I am grateful for that. Thank you.
Yeah, artists literally called me 10 minutes before 12 and said, what am I supposed to do? So, so we talked about 5 minutes and then we had to go and he jumped on. So a lot of credit to artists for literally jumping in at literally the last minute. So I thought he did a great job.
Absolutely.
Rudy's going to pay the price for that.
No. All right,
About an
folks.
hour.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Have a good weekend, everybody. I'm going to sign off. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lyra.